Aristotle's Way. Written by Edith Hall. Summarized by goldreaders.com. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Introduction. At first glance, ancient Greece and our modern era might seem completely different. Our societies today are much larger, faster, and more intricate than anything that existed in ancient times. It's mind-boggling to imagine how someone from back then would react if they were suddenly placed in a bustling city like New York or Tokyo. However, despite the apparent differences, both ancient Greece and the present world present similar challenges to every individual. Whether in the ancient past or today, human lives are relatively short, and finding happiness requires us to lead purposeful and fulfilling lives. The fundamental question remains, how do we achieve this? Aristotle also grappled with this question. When Edith Hall, a British expert on classical studies, encountered Aristotle's answer to this question at the age of 20, it was a profound revelation that significantly improved her life. In the following summary, we'll accompany Hall as she dissects the teachings she gained from Aristotle regarding happiness and living a virtuous life. Additionally, you'll discover techniques for captivating an audience without resorting to insincere compliments. The idea that excessive or deficient anger is a flaw, but moderate anger is a virtue. How to identify a questionable assumption in someone's argument. Chapter 1. Philosopher of Questions and Ideas. Imagine trying to make a list of things Aristotle didn't write about. It's actually easier than listing what he did write about. He was curious about all sorts of topics. What is being? Why do animals act the way they do? What's the best way to run a government? How can we live a good life? These were some of the questions he tried to answer. Aristotle's ideas helped create the basis for many areas of study. Without him, subjects like metaphysics, thinking about existence, zoology, studying animals, political philosophy, government ideas, and ethics, how to be good, might not have developed the same way. Even though his accomplishments might seem intimidating, it's worth noting that he didn't achieve everything until later in life. Now, let's talk about who Aristotle was. He had a pretty unsettled life, and he only wrote the famous stuff in the last 12 years of his life. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in a place called Stagira in Greece. His life got really tough when he was 13, both his mom and dad died. This was a tough time in Greece, with a lot of fighting, and he had to move around because of it. When he was 17, he ended up in Athens, which was like the education and culture hub of ancient Greece. He joined Plato's Academy, the first ever university in the Western world. He spent about 20 years learning from Plato, who was a super important philosopher at the time. After Plato died, Aristotle left Athens and moved to a kingdom in what's now part of Turkey. He married the daughter of the ruler there and studied animals on an island. Then, in 343 BCE, things changed again. The king of a place called Macedonia asked Aristotle to teach his son, Alexander, who later became Alexander the Great. Aristotle didn't really like the tricky and sneaky stuff at the king's court. When the king was killed and Alexander became king, Aristotle went back to Athens. He spent the last 12 years of his life in Athens, and that's when he did his most important work. All the famous writings we remember him for were written during this time. Someone once said that no ancient thinker can relate to today's worries and problems more than Aristotle. And that's what we'll explore in the next parts. Chapter 2. The Essence of Humanity. What does it mean to be human? When Aristotle raises this question, he makes a series of distinctions. To accomplish this, he poses another query: what sets human beings apart? The fact that they eat and grow isn't unique. For instance, plants and animals also do that. Their possession of senses and their use of those senses to understand the world around them isn't distinctive either, as other animals also have these senses and use them similarly. Ultimately, Aristotle arrives at a characteristic he believes is truly unique: reason. He argues that humans engage in actions and can think before, during, and after these actions. This is what defines our humanity. However, this isn't just a theoretical idea, it holds significant practical consequences. When Aristotle discusses happiness, he uses the ancient Greek term eudaimonia. This word can have various meanings. For instance, one common interpretation is prosperity. Yet, Aristotle dismisses the notion that happiness is linked to material wealth. He quotes an earlier Greek philosopher, Democritus, who stated that the happiness of the soul can't be purchased with gold or livestock. Eudaimonia isn't just a feeling either. Aristotle argues that if happiness were merely a possession, even a person who spent their life sleeping and existing passively could be considered happy. This isn't a definition he agrees with. This leads him to the idea that happiness is an action, something you actively do. But how do you do happiness? Aristotle suggests that humans derive pleasure from learning and contemplating the world. In other words, we are most content when we reflect on our experience of being alive. At this point, Aristotle's concept of happiness starts to align with his notion of human nature. Thinking is what defines us, and it's also what brings us joy. This implies that the purpose of life is happiness. And if, as Aristotle concludes, the aim of human life is happiness, then the best approach to attain it is to contemplate how to live well or how to make the most of our existence. Now, let's delve into how this applies to everyday situations. Chapter 3. Blueprint for Better Decisions. Neuroscientists have discovered that we make numerous decisions every day. Most of these are not very important, like choosing what to eat or watch on Netflix, and they don't require much thought. However, there are more significant choices we face. Deciding when to commit to a partner, whether to have children and when, or even considering divorce, greatly shape our lives and overall happiness. These decisions need careful thinking. So, how do we approach such important choices? While Aristotle might not have direct answers to our specific problems, he does offer guidance on how to handle these decisions. Aristotle believes that making good decisions is crucial for leading a good life. He provides a framework for effective decision-making that can be extracted from his writings. This framework consists of 3 rules that apply to all major decisions. The first rule is to avoid rushing into decisions. Aristotle suggests that hasty decisions lack proper thought. For instance, if you're considering breaking up with your partner after a big fight, Aristotle would advise waiting, as your perspective might change over time. This aligns with the saying, "deliberate at night," similar to today's advice to sleep on it. The second rule is to verify information. If you hear rumors about your spouse cheating, it's important to recognize that rumors aren't facts and could be false. Before taking action, you should try to confirm the truth. While hiring a private investigator might be extreme, Aristotle would appreciate your determination to find the facts. Alternatively, you could simply talk to your partner and gauge their response. Verifying information connects closely with the third rule: seek advice from experts. Would you board an airplane flown by someone who has never piloted before? Probably not. This idea holds value, and it's worth remembering when you're faced with a dilemma. As Aristotle suggests, if you lack expertise in a certain matter, find someone knowledgeable to consult. Chapter 4. Persuasive Speaking. One of Aristotle's most important works is about rhetoric, which is the skill of speaking persuasively. The Greeks admired this skill for a long time, but by the time Aristotle wrote about it in the 4th century BCE, it had a bad reputation. People used to think rhetoric was noble, but now it was seen as a tool used by dishonest politicians to deceive the public. Aristotle's teacher, Plato, made a distinction between philosophers who seek truth and sophists, who manipulate and try to influence opinions. Aristotle didn't want to abandon rhetoric. He wanted to help people recognize the tricks used by these manipulators. The simplest yet most important forms of arguments are based on statements called premises. When you combine two premises, you can figure out a third statement, which is the conclusion or truth. This type of argument is called a syllogism, meaning inference in Greek. Here's an example. Premise 1: all philosophers are human. Premise 2: Aristotle is a philosopher. Conclusion: Aristotle is a human. If both starting statements are true, the conclusion must also be true. But skilled speakers mislead by introducing wrong premises. When these aren't noticed, people are led to strong-sounding but false conclusions. For instance, a friend of the author used a flawed premise in an argument with his wife, Susan. Premise 1: Susan is in psychotherapy. Premise 2: people go to psychotherapy because they are psychologically inadequate. Conclusion: Susan is psychologically inadequate. By making the first premise certain, which it was, as Susan was in psychotherapy, the second premise becomes more believable. This is a spot where someone can hide a weak point in their argument. However, Susan saw that her husband's argument relied on a shaky premise. She changed the syllogism this way. Premise 1: Susan is in psychotherapy. Premise 2: signing up for psychotherapy shows psychological intelligence and adequacy. Conclusion: Susan is psychologically intelligent and adequate. Now, Susan's second premise isn't completely certain either, but that's exactly what she wanted to point out. The conclusion is only as strong as the ideas it's based on, and her husband was using a trick like the sophists do, making a debatable point seem like a solid fact. Chapter 5. Purposes of Rhetoric. What's your goal when using rhetoric? Aristotle explains that rhetoric serves three purposes. Firstly, it aims to persuade an audience to accept a version of the past, such as in courtroom debates. Secondly, it celebrates people or institutions in the present, like a wedding speech honoring a newlywed couple. The third purpose is to convince someone to take a specific action in the future. This form of rhetoric can have significant historical impacts and is associated with renowned speakers like Pericles from Athens' Golden Age. However, this kind of rhetoric isn't solely tied to major historical shifts. One scenario where rhetoric heavily influences your life is during job applications. Your future career and happiness often rely on effective communication at this juncture. Luckily, Aristotle's guidance can aid you in crafting an impressive cover letter. Aristotle's advice can be summarized as an ABC of persuasive rhetoric. The A represents the audience. Aristotle suggests that rhetoric involves emotions. To succeed, you should make your audience feel positive about themselves. While flattery might seem like an option, insincerity is usually evident. Instead, gather information about your audience, those who will read your application. Some information will be public, while the rest should be well known in your field. Understanding your audience lets you show that you've thoughtfully considered them and hold them in high regard. The B symbolizes brevity, a key principle of rhetoric. When persuading someone, less is often more. Why? According to Aristotle, effective persuasion for future actions only requires two components: stating what you want and providing reasons why it's a good idea. In other words, your cover letter should focus on why you want the job and why you're deserving of it. Other details are unnecessary. Lastly, C stands for clarity. This aspect of Aristotle's advice is straightforward. If people don't comprehend your argument, you'll fail to persuade them. Chapter 6. Virtuous Living. In ancient Greece, there were various schools of thought about philosophy. Despite their lively debates, many of these schools agreed that living a virtuous life involved giving up certain things. For example, the Stoics believed in controlling their emotions and physical desires, arguing that a virtuous life was focused on intellectual pursuits. Epicureans, on the other hand, rejected the pursuit of power, fame, and wealth, and instead sought contentment in simple pleasures. Cynics like Diogenes went even further, rejecting material possessions and societal norms by living simply. Aristotle took a different approach. He didn't advocate for complete renunciation; instead, he believed in moderation. The main idea here is that virtue comes from finding a balanced middle ground. Is anger a good or bad thing? According to Aristotle, it depends on how much of it you have. He suggests that some anger is necessary for a healthy personality because it helps you respond to injustice. This means that anger can be virtuous. However, if you're constantly losing your temper over small things, that's a sign of a vice, being rude and obnoxious. So, anger can also be a negative trait. The right amount of anger falls between these two extremes, and Aristotle calls this balanced point the meson, which means middle in Greek. Virtue isn't the opposite of vice, it's the middle path between two related vices. Consider generosity, for instance. Too little generosity leads to being miserly, while too much generosity results in wastefulness. How can you stay on this middle path? Aristotle suggests the ancient Greek saying, "Know thyself." By paying close attention to your feelings and thoughts, you can identify the balanced middle ground. Here's how it works. When you're trying to find the middle way, you can often tell which direction you're leaning toward based on what brings you intense pleasure. For instance, having an affair might bring more pleasure than completely abstaining from relationships, which is the opposite extreme. The middle path, in this case, would involve maintaining a faithful relationship. This might not provide as much immediate pleasure as an affair, but following this virtuous path is more likely to lead to long-term happiness. Chapter 7. The Essence of Friendship. We often classify different types of relationships by considering whether they involve a romantic aspect or not. For instance, we share intimate romantic relationships with partners, while our closeness with family members is intimate but not romantic. While we're born into the latter kind of relationship with family, we freely select our friends, forming non-romantic relationships with them. Aristotle has a different perspective. He sees all relationships as a subset of the broader category of friends, or philoi. Differentiating these relationships isn't based on sexual aspects or biological factors, it's about the depth of friendship. The main idea here is that understanding the distinctions among these three kinds of friendship can help you appreciate them for what they are. According to Aristotle, most friendships are utilitarian, both parties gain something from the friendship. This is like a sort of social exchange, and even animals engage in it. For instance, the sandpiper bird cleans crocodile teeth and receives food in return. Aristotle doesn't find anything wrong with utilitarian friendships, but he notes they have clear limits. Crossing these boundaries can damage the friendship. That's why you shouldn't ask a friend from a rideshare to lend you money. Then there are pleasure friendships, where both individuals benefit equally from the relationship. Imagine two witty people who enjoy each other's company because they make each other laugh. There are boundaries here as well. A friend who shares your interest in Japanese cinema or vintage French wine is unlikely to provide support during a health crisis. Aristotle points out that both utilitarian and pleasure-based friendships are easily broken when circumstances change. If your neighbor moves away, you won't continue looking after her dog, and she won't take care of your cats. Similarly, romantic partners whose relationship is based on mutual physical attraction may grow apart as their looks change. This brings us to the most intense form of friendship, love. Aristotle explains this by comparing choosing friends to choosing a coat. When your coat becomes worn, you replace it, as the old one is no longer useful. Love means you can't treat friends this way. The longer you know them and the more time affects their appearance, the more you value their goodness. Aristotle concludes that these friends make the best life partners. Conclusion. Aristotle used to travel and give advice to kings, but he eventually made Athens his home in the middle of the 4th century BCE to focus on philosophy and ethics. He pondered the question of how we should lead our lives. His response was that we should live thoughtfully. This involves mastering the skill of making careful choices, using persuasive language for honest discussions rather than trickery, and cherishing various levels of friendship appropriately. Above all, it means valuing balance and moderation as the most important virtue.